Hi, Rod Kane here. Here to make another video once again about my go-to ancients and medieval warfare war game. Um, so my previous video I talked a little bit about setting up the Battle of Asculum. So I want to talk a little bit about the Battle of Asculum. I'm hoping to film the battle and then go over some of the highlights of it. First off, let's talk about why the Battle of Asculum, and why would I want to recreate this battle. For those of you that don't know, it is the battle that coined the famous Pyrrhic victory phrase. It's a battle between the forces of Pyrrhus of Epirus and the early Roman Republic. Pyrrhus has invaded the Greek peninsula. He's already fought the Romans once at the Battle of Heraclea, defeating the army, the Roman army. And this is his second battle with the Romans, where he defeats the Romans again, historically. However, the cost of the victory is so high, it coins the term Pyrrhic victory. So just some background. First of all, I wanted to highlight this book, which is Greece and Rome at War by Peter Connolly. This is an excellent reference book if you're interested in this time period, if you can get your hands on a copy of it. Very, very useful resource for this time period. So what's happening with the Roman Empire at this time period? First of all, it's not an empire yet. It's more like a very powerful city-state. It's starting to build up its territory in Italy. I mentioned, I think in my previous video, I talked about this being the Polybian Roman army. It's really a Camillan Roman army. When you look in Meshwesh, you're going to see the Romans are starting to form the maniples and the legion. It's a very interesting time period. Prior to this, Roman army would have been more of a hoplite force, and around 400, 300 BC, the Roman armies went through a series of defeats where they were defeated by the Gauls, they were defeated by the Samnites, and after the Gallic defeat, a general called Camillus came in and reformed the army, and he created the maniple formations. So what we think of as the Hastati, the Princeps, and the Triarii, and then the Roman legion grew out of those reforms. Shortly after Camillus reformed the army, we get into the Polybius period, which is still in that formation, some slight changes. So the Roman army at this time is elite foot, armed differently than their traditional hoplite soldiers. They have the long shields, which helps reduce the need for the heavier armor, and that they've replaced the long spear with javelins, which they picked up from the Samnite Wars, and a short stabbing sword, which works really well in close order combat or areas where you don't have a lot of room to swing the sword. And then more importantly probably is the maniple formation, which allows them to move in a looser formation than the phalanx. The phalanx was an extremely large, clumsy formation. The later deep phalanx and the pike formation, which grew out of that, once again, very powerful to front, very heavy formation on the need to maintain cohesion, but it wasn't very flexible. So terrain became a factor for the phalanx, and it was always an issue for a phalanx army looking for the optimum battlefield. Ascalum is interesting because at Ascalum, the two armies, which was very common in medieval warfare, they'd line up across the banks of a river, and one had to decide whether they're going to cross or not. And Pyrrhus was holding the bank of the river, but he realized the ground wasn't very suitable for his phalanx formation, so he withdrew from the bank of the river. One, because he wanted to have a battle with the Romans, he wanted to draw them into battle, and he knew they weren't going to cross the river in the face of his army. And two, the ground near the river was not favorable to his phalanx formation. It was too rough. It was difficult for him to deploy and fight properly in that territory, so he pulled back to more open ground. So for this Battle of Asculum, the Romans have crossed the river, and Pyrrhus has lined up his phalanx formation in nice open ground The flanks have some forest and some rough terrain, and behind the Roman line, you're going to see that there's also some steep hills because they kind of came over the bank and the hills by the riverside onto the open ground. But where they actually fight, it's pretty open ground. So what I'm going to do is we're going to change the camera angle a little bit. We're going to go along the lines. I'm going to describe the troops and the forces that I have for this battle and a little bit about the armies. And then, like I said, we're going to fight this battle out and see how it goes. Okay, so let's take a quick look at top-down battlefield. Then I'll do a little bit of a zoom in on the troops. To give you an overall idea, when I design these Grand Triumph scenarios, I'm typically designing them as 144 points. Unless there's a specific reason to, I try to keep the commands 48 points each so that it makes for a nice clean battle where everybody's commanding about the same number of forces. It can be a 2-on-2, a 1-on-1, or a 3-on-3. When I typically do this at a convention game, I make it 3-on-3. So commands for Pyrrhus, for example, this is a 48-point command. I marked this with a Triumph battle card where the command splits off. 48 command point on the other flank. And then we have basically the center, which is just primarily pike. So taking a look at Pyrrhus's command first, the flank is composed of cavalry. Pyrrhus did have a cavalry advantage in most of his battles, both in quality and quantity. So he's got some jav cav, some bad horse. Light foot, kind of screening the elephants, which Pyrrhus famously brought 20 elephants to Rome, to Italy. At this point, he was down to 19, according to the documentation. Barely qualifies for putting elephant forces on the battle in this scale, but they were such a factor in the battle, you've got to include them in the battle, otherwise it doesn't really make sense. Then he's got some Greek allies from the continent, which is the whole reason he was there, because he was invited by the Greek colonists in Italy to come and help them with the oppressive Romans. Pike, these are pike he's raised quickly from the Italian peninsula. These are Greek fighting and Greek hoplite style. Then his main force of phalangitae, which he brought with him. This is the primary pike body here. Pyrrhus himself is represented by a force of knights fighting kind of like the old companions of Macedon. Behind the knights, which is a little bit off camera, will be a camp. I do put Pyrrhus's camp on the board because it was a factor in the battle. The Romans did actually sack the camp at one point, which was part of the reason why they called it a Pyrrhic victory. The two knights accompanying Pyrrhus to add to his cavalry impact. Then we start the other command, which is a mirror image of the right flank. Not for any particular reason other than it makes sense with the forces on the battle and probably the way it was deployed. So once again, phalanx in the center, lighter forces on the flanks, and cavalry on the wings. The elephants tended to be held in reserve by Pyrrhus in a lot of these battles, and in the case of Asculum, they were held until towards the end of the battle. That's when they actually had an impact. Let's take a look at the Roman forces. So the Romans are lined up in a slightly thinner line of elite forces or elite troops. So the guys wearing the red tunics are going to be our elites. The guys in the less uniformed style, but still fighting the same type of weaponry, are the Italian allied legions on either flank. Command break is approximately here and here. The Jav Cav General, this is the overall command representing the two consuls, potentially, that were commanding the army at this time. The two consuls in the Roman army at this time would have been Publius Decius Mus, although there is some debate about whether he actually died before the battle took place, and Publius Sulpicius Severio. Now, Rome had a tendency in the Republic days to send out two generals who would take turns commanding. They'd alternate days as far as overall command. So in this particular time period, they didn't have a dictatorship going on. They had these consuls who would go out and they would share command of the army. Those are the two guys that were supposedly here at this battle. Severio was probably in command because it looks like Mus might have died before the battle. depending on which account you look at. The Romans, at this time, the Veliti, or the Velites, depending on how you like to pronounce it, Velite being the Latin pronunciation, didn't exist. So that traditional light foot with the round shield and javelins, those guys weren't there yet. So if you look at the Meshwesh army, you'll see Camillan Roman, Polybian Roman. You're really dealing with rabble and maybe some skirmishers, but you don't have the light foot traditional Velite. If you have light foot in those armies, they're going to be these guys on the end, which are Italian allied troops. So what you have is the skirmishers, and the skirmishers would probably be represented by the Roreri or the Asieni, which don't have a lot of information on them, but we know that they had basically javelin-armed troops, javelin-armed use, maybe with shields, and this is perfectly represented by rabble and triumph. As we mentioned in the upgraded rules, the rabble now have the ability to fall back through after they lose. So just like skirmishers, they can fall back through these heavier troops behind them, which allows you to put them up front and use them to skirmish and pull the enemy troops out of line. So the Romans are definitely going to try to do this in this battle because they need to yank those pikemen out of line so they can get the double overlap or single overlap. More importantly, without the rear rank pulling, supporting, if they can pull it off. It does take a little bit of effort to pull it off. On the ends of the line, the Romans have some bad horse, a little bit of jav cav, a little bit of light troops. The Roman horse at this battle were famous for fighting in a dismounted fashion. So one of the reasons why Romans at this time have bad horses, their primary cavalry contingent, is they were always cavalry poor, but they also had a tendency to use the horses as transport. They actually fight in a stationary, infantry-like fashion, even though they had cavalry or horses. Like you said, that fits perfectly with the triumph bad horse designation. And then more interesting, maybe for this particular battle, another reason why I wanted to do it was because of these war wagons, which are not war wagons. They're basically carts that the Romans concocted to try and counteract the elephants. And I'm going to take the camera angle again, zoom in on some of the troops, and explain a little bit more about these /war wagon cart, anti-elephant carts that the Romans came up with. Terrain-wise, behind the Romans, you'll see a little bit of what's going to be rough going, because this represents a terrain that they crossed after they left the river to get to Pyrrhus. So if they get pushed back, there will be some terrain problems for the Romans if they get pushed back too far. So we're starting on the right flank of Pyrrhus's line, showing the jav cav, the light foot, elephants held back in reserve, Italian-based hoplites. At this point, they would have the deep hoplite formation ability, so if they're double ranked, they do get a slight bonus. These are going to be guys that they've converted from Italy into pike, as well as some Macedonian-style phalangites. So they've started to equip the Italian allies in the pike formation. This is pulling from the Italian ranks, so you see that these guys are actually dressed in the Italian style uniforms, but quickly thrown together as a pike unit. Pyrrhus's phalangitae that he brought from Epirus with him, skirmishers out in front to protect the line. You can see Pyrrhus on his heavy cavalry mounts in the rear. That's going to be the knights, similar to companions of Macedon. And then some more of the levy pike. I've done these up with the white shields because they did talk about him having white shields, which would have been like the recruit pike or newly recruited pike. So that's kind of how I've modeled them. More of the Macedonian ones to kind of shore up the line. Pike generals on both flanks. And then finishing out with the hoplites, the light foot from the Greeks, and some mounted, and the elephant once again in reserve. Let's take a look at the Romans now, a little closer. All right, starting on the Roman right flank, we've got some Italian light infantry. Like I said, at this point in time, the Romans relied on Italians Samnites, Etruscans, the different tribes for their Lightfoot. They did not have the velites. They had not developed that more Romanized light infantry that's so famous at this point in time. Some Javcav, bad horse. Once again, Italian allies that are mounted. The rabble. The rabble is what the Romans are using this time period as their skirmishing troops. Younger men, poorly equipped, no armor, moving fast, loose formation, easily panic from battle, but they can be used to break up the enemy formation. We've got our Italian allied legion. And then, of course, we can't ignore the anti-elephant in the room. These are the anti-elephant carts that I created. Based on the descriptions, I went with what I thought was one of the dumbest looking designs, which is the cart has basically oxen with a pushing rig in the back. Now, why would I do that? One, that was partially in the descriptions and some of the drawings I could find online. And two, it looks really stupid. So I kind of went for the maximum stupid factor. Now, the carts were not successful in the real battle, but the idea was you had guys with big, long, pointy sticks, tridents, grappling hooks even, archers, guys with long torches on the end of a long stick, and the idea was to try and scare, frighten, hurt, or otherwise panic the elephants. In the actual battle, the light infantry of Pyrrhus got to these guys and tore them apart because they weren't really... They were designed to scare elephants, but they weren't really ready to fight infantry. So we'll see how this works. In Triumph, I've got this set up as a modified Plastrella, which is a battle card you can use in the Triumph historical armies, which means it's kind of like a heavy foot, but it does better against mounted. I'm giving it a 3-sided capability, kind of like a war wagon, but the rear, where its mobility portion comes from, if an enemy unit touches the stand with the cattle, it loses mobility immediately. So this thing can be pushed around on the battlefield, but only if it can keep the enemy off of that rear flank. Now, Roman main line. We start to get into the elite infantry or elite foot general, more elite foot, double ranked for reserves. You can see these are modeled in the Polybian/Camillan Roman style, where you have the hastati, which are slightly lighter armed, the princeps, which are starting to wear the chainmail at this period of time in the late Camillan, early Polybian time frame. Triarii, which are the veterans with the spears, still using the spears to the back, but they also are equipped with the Roman short sword. That's that Javcav general. And then we finish out the Roman line basically with a mirror image of the other flank. So the left flank is a mirror image of the right flank. And there's your other anti-elephant cart. They built these after the Battle of Heraclea because of the elephants. They were trying to come up with something that would counter those elephants. And it didn't work out so well, but I thought they were interesting enough that we should put them on the battlefield. And they were significantly mentioned in the historical write-ups. So that concludes our two forces lined up and ready to fight this battle. And we'll see if Pyrrhus can win another victory. Also, to the rear of Pyrrhus's line, we'll have his camp set up. So he'll have a small camp. The reason I include the camp in this battle, which I don't typically include in my historical scenarios, is because it was actually sacked by the Romans during the battle towards the end. So if a camp falls into the historical scenario because it was mentioned as part of the battle having taken place, then I usually try to include it in my historical scenarios. Otherwise, for the convention games, I leave the camps out. All right, so shortly we'll get back to this and see how the battle takes place.